All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Today's daf is Yud Ches. Let's pick up on Yud 18. Let's pick up on Yud Ches Amud Aleph 18a, 4 lines down from the top. Massive Rav Hamnuna. So again, I will say just to reorient ourselves a little bit, we are still in the middle of this machlokes between Rav Huna and Shmuel. Remember, what did the Mishnah teach us? The Mishnah taught us that there is a neder b'soch neder, but there is no shvua b'soch shvua. Rav Huna and Shmuel disagree on the scope of the neder b'soch neder case. Rav Huna holds that it's only if a person says harini nazir hayom harini nazir lemachar, in which case, since the second neder adds something additional in the first day, or say in the second neder nazirus, it adds on a 31st day, therefore the second neder takes effect. But according to Rav Huna, if you said Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Hayom, the second neder would not take effect at all. On the other hand, Shmuel says no. Even if a person says Hareini Nazir Hayom, Hareini Nazir Hayom, ultimately it works. And remember again, Rav Huna has his parallel case by Shavua. What's the parallel case by Shavua? Where a person says Shavua sheni ochel te'enim, and then a second Shavua is Shavua sheni ochel te'enim va'anovim. That by Shavua I won't eat figs. And then a second shvuah says, I won't eat figs and I won't eat grapes. Even though according to Rabbah, such a shvuah works, we established that according to that Rav Huna does not hold like Rabbah, and therefore again, we say that case doesn't. That would be the parallel case by shvuah. So it says the Gemara, massive Rav Hamnuna. So Rav Hamnuna raised a kasha. What was the kasha? Nazir lahazir. Remember again, the pasuk says, as I said a few days ago, we get a lot of mileage out of this double lashon. So the Torah says nazir lahazir, that literally if a person will take a Nazirite vow, ish kiyafli lindor neder nazir lahazir lashem. A person's taking a neder nazir lahazir. So ultimately says the Gemara, what does that mean? So nazir lahazir mikan shanaziros chal al hanaziros. From here we learn that what? That we'll say naziros could be chal on naziros. That if one neder naziros could go ahead and take place, or I should say devolve upon the individual, even if there is already an existing neder naziros. So says the Gemara, shiyachol v'halo dinhu. Now we'll say, now why is this a novel thing? Because I might have thought a little bit differently. I might have thought the following: Uma shvua chamura ein shvua chal al shvua. Because I could have made the following argument, and the argument is like this: when it comes to a shvua, so a shvua is considered to be something stringent, and therefore, again, one shvua cannot be chal on another shvua. But remember, interestingly enough, we saw from the Mishnah, that's a principle that everyone agrees with, that one shvua cannot be chal, one shvua cannot devolve upon the individual when there is a pre-existing shvua already there. So I would have constructed the following argument. If shvua, which is more chomer, which is more strict, if oath, which is more strict than neder, than vow, so one shvua cannot devolve upon another shvuah, so I might have said then what? So Naziros kala lakol shekain. Then certainly Naziros, which Shabbos is a neder, certainly Nedarim, which are Naziros, which is considered to be more lenient, so one neder Naziros cannot devolve upon another one. So the Gemara says, therefore the Torah says, Talmud Lomar, Nazir lahazir. Therefore the Torah purposely says, Lashon of Nazir lahazir, Mikan shahanaziros chal al hanaziros. From here we see that what? That one neder nazirus could take effect upon the individual, even if there's already a pre-existing neder nazirus. It says the Gemara, fine. So it says, here's what we've established. So we've established that one neder nazirus can take effect even on top of a pre-existing neder nazirus. That concept does not apply by Shavuot. Now it says the Gemara, Hechi Dami. So what is the case of where one neder nazirus could take effect upon another already pre-existing neder nazirus? Says the Gemara, Ilema da'amar harini nazir hayom, harini nazir lamachar. So if a person is saying, I am a nazir today, I'm a nazir tomorrow, if that's really what the person is saying, then krabaya, then I'll both say, why do I need a pasuk to teach me that works? That works intuitively. Why does it work intuitively? Because what is the second neder adding on? So another day. So remember again, once the second neder is adding on another day, then by definition we know that therefore second neder will extend through day 31. There's no such thing as a one-day nazirus. Once that extra day is added, that extra day essentially triggers another 30-day period. Fine. So I don't need a pasuk. I don't need nazir lahazir to teach me that one neder nazirus should devolve upon a pre-existing neder nazirus. So rather, what case do I need? What is the chiddush case? Ela lav da amar harini nazir hayom harini nazir hayom. Oh, rather, what's the novelty case? The novelty case is where I say, I am a nazir today, I am a nazir today. And yet, what do we see? Vikatani nazirus chal al nazirus. And what does the Brisa tell me? The Brisa tells me that even if I say harini nazir hayom, we'll say, what is that halacha? That the second neder nazirus works. What does that show you? It shows you that the halacha is not like Rav Huna, but rather follows Shmuel. That in fact, if you say harini nazir hayom twice, that the second neder in fact does work. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, no, not necessarily. We could reinterpret the case differently." What's the case here? What's the case? Where I accepted simultaneously two nidrei naziros. I will say, if you remember again, we had this yesterday, where everyone will agree. You see, Rav Huna and Shmuel only argue on the case of where a person says two distinct vows, Harini Nazir Hayom, Harini Nazir. I am a Nazir today, I am a Nazir today. Rav Huna says that second statement is meaningless because it didn't add anything to the first. Shmuel said, no, it works. He's made two Nidrei Naziros and must observe two consecutive periods of Naziros. So 60 days, two 30-day periods. But even Rav Huna will agree that if a person says, Harini mekabel al atzmi shtei nidrei nazirus, that if a person says, I accept upon myself two periods of nazirus, that even what? Even Rav Huna will agree that that works. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting over here is that perhaps what the pasuk of Nazir the Hazir is teaching me is the fact that if a person accepts upon himself two simultaneous periods of nazirus at once, that lemaisa again, that works. I'm learning that out based on the pasuk. So the Gemara says, Umay chumra d'shvua mineder. So let's go back for just a moment. So now what we've shown is that this brisa need not be a kasha on Rav Huna. Okay. Now the Gemara goes back because remember, what did the Mishnah say? What did the brisa say? The brisa said that I need Nazir lahazir. Why? Because without Nazir lahazir, I would have constructed the following argument. I would have said that the same way that Shvua is not Chal on Shvua, and that's Chomer, so I would have said certainly Neder is not Chal on Neder, or Nazir is not Chal on Nazir. So the Gemara asks, by the way, Umay Chomer de Shvua mi Neder. When you say that a Shvua is more Chomer, is stricter than a Neder, an oath is stricter than a vow, how so? How so? What do you mean by that? So maybe you'll say, well, Abosai, we know this already, that what's unique about a shvuah can be chal on an intangible, right? A person could prohibit sleep upon themselves, or a person could go ahead and prohibit any intangible item. On the other hand, but neder cannot. Neder has to be on a davar sheyesh bo mamish, has to be something to it. Like I say, on the other hand, neder nami chomer shekin chal al ha-mitzvah kirishus. On the other hand, I could say that what? Neder is more chomer than shvuah. Why, I will say? Because remember, can you take a shvuah not to put on tefillin? Can you take a shvuah not to put on tefillin? No, such a shvuah is ineffective. But what can you do? I can make a neder not to get any benefit or not to wear this pair of tefillin. Now, granted, I can't make a neder on the mitzvah, but I can make a neder on the chavtzah. So remember, this was yesterday's daf. 2 days ago. So on the other hand, I can say that maybe neder is more chomer because I can make a neder prohibiting a mitzvah, but yet I can't make a shivua prohibiting a mitzvah. To which the Gemara says, Elamishum. So what is the chumrah that shivua has over neder? Elamishum dechsiv ba b'shvua lo yinakeh. Here's the difference. The difference is that by shivua, the Torah says that if you go ahead and lo sisa Shem Hashem alokach ala shav, Kilo yinakei Hashem es asher yisa eshmo lashav. So it's very strong wording here. That the Torah explicitly says by the Aseres Hadibros that you shall not go ahead and take out Kodesh Baruch Hu's name in vain, which the Gemara's understanding now refers to an oath in vain, because if you do so, you will not be cleansed. You will not find absolution in God. So the fact that the Torah uses this strong lashon by Shvuah as opposed to Neder indicates that Shvuah is more chamer than Neder. Fine. I will say again, I just want to point out. We did not go ahead and resolve this particular machlokes between Rav Huna and Shmuel. I'll just tell you, just so you should know halacha l'maisa. I'll show you. I'll read you the Shulchan Aruch. Just as an aside, by the way, there's an excellent app called Uvalechtecha Baderech. It's a free app. Mamish, a free app, and it has Kol HaTorah Kula on it. It's absolutely amazing. So listen to this. So in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Reish Lamed, I'm telling you, Mashiach is definitely coming. You can see it's just an amazing thing. So this is in the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Lamed. I don't use the internet. I just want to be clear. Sorry, right? I'm sorry. Wi-Fi. Okay, fine. Sorry. So in Siman Reish Lamed Tes. In Siman Reish Lamed Tes, so the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, Shulchan Aruch says, Amar, first of all, Amar Hareini Nazir, Chalu Shnehem, V'tzarech Linhok Shtei Naziros. So we'll say, first of all, Shulchan Aruch Paskins, like Shmuel, that if a person says, Hareini Nazir Hayom, person makes two concurrent Nidrei Naziros, it works. I remember again, what does that mean? It means that it's double, meaning so he's taken upon himself two consecutive periods of 30 days. So that's number one. Halach Lamaisa, we Paskin like Shmuel, that if you say Hareini Nazir Hayom, it works. Two consecutive. Of course, if you say Hareini Nazir Lamachar, of course that works as well. The novelty is that even if you made two identical statements, that lemaisa it creates two periods of naziros. And next, the halacha is ein shvua chal al shvua. One shvua cannot devolve upon another shvua. Shim amar shvua shelo ochal kikarzu, shvua shelo ochal kikarzu, ein hashniya chala. So let's say again, but however we do paskin ein shvua. Ein shvua chalal shvua, which means that if you make two of the same shvuas, then what? The second one is absolutely meaningless. We will see an exception to that rule in just a moment, but I'm not going to read it to you yet, because first we have to see the Gemara. So bottom line is we paskin like Shmuel. Says the Gemara, shvua shelo ochal, ve'enu chai v'la'achal. So we'll say if a person made a shvua, I will not eat this loaf of bread, and then a person makes another identical shvua, I will not eat this loaf of bread, and you end up eating the loaf of bread. So what is the halacha? You're only chayiv once. You're only chayiv for one violation. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, but a very interesting halacha. Em nishal al harishon shniya chala alav. But says Rava, if you were released from the first shvua, so we'll discuss the mechanics of this. But let's say a person essentially did like a release. They had a revocation of the oath, which we'll discuss how that happens. If a person has a revocation of the oath, then the first oath is gone, the second oath sets in. In other words, what Rava is suggesting is that when we say, if a person says, Shvua that I won't eat this loaf, I swear I won't eat this loaf, I swear I won't eat this loaf. So the second statement is essentially ineffective and meaningless. Why? Because there's no room for it to take hold. But if you're released from the first oath, then what? Then the second one has the ability to take hold. So the Gemara says, Mimai, where do we know this from? Midalo katani eno ela achos, v'katani eno chayiv ela achos. So the Gemara makes an interesting diuk, an interesting observation. The Mishnah says that if you make two identical shvuas, the Mishnah says you're only chayiv once. But it doesn't say that there's only one shvua. When it says you're only chayiv once, what the Mishnah is telling me is the second shvua can be effective under certain circumstances, but for liability purposes, you're only going to be chayiv once. So what does the Mishnah mean? Rafchohu delesle. There is no room for the second shvua to really devolve upon the individual. However, kimitshal al chaverta, but when you go ahead and have the first neder revoked or annulled, then chayla lishna achrina. Then chayla. Then the second shvua has the ability to devolve upon the individual. So interestingly enough, as much as we say ein shvua chalal shvua, that one shvua cannot go ahead and take a second identical shvua cannot devolve upon the individual. However, if a person is released somehow from the first oath, the second oath has the ability to set it, and by the way, that is indeed how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. That's why the lashon of that sif that I stopped reading to in the middle says, even though we say in shvua chal al shvua, listen to this, aval im nishal al harishona chala hashniya. Interestingly enough, again, if you are released from the first oath, the second oath sets in. So the Gemara says, lishnachrina, there is another version of this exchange, chiyuva hu deleka. We'll say if you make two identical vows, there is no liability, there's no chiyuv. If one violates the second vow, Hashavua ika. But yet again, the vow itself still is there. So we'll say it's one of these interesting things the Gemara is saying, where I say Shavu, I'm not going to. I swear I'm not going to eat the loaf. I swear I'm not going to eat the loaf. So right now, in my present circumstances, that second vow is meaningless, but it doesn't go away. See, the Havamim, when I read the Mishnah, I assume that when it says in Shavuot Chal Shul, what that means is that second Shavuot, it's like it's nothing. It's like I never made it. Now what Rav is saying is, no, that's not the case. The second Shavuot is there. It's kind of just in suspended animation. If nothing ever happens with the first Shavuot, meaning that the first Shavuot remains in effect, then the second Shavuot essentially just remains standing there. But if for some reason the first Shavuot is knocked out, then what? That gives the halachic room, the halachic framework for the second Shavuot to set in. So it's kind of like sitting there in suspended animation to see if something happens with Shavuot number one. So we'll say in this second Lashon, so the Gemara says, when you make two identical oaths, so there will be no chiyuv, no liability for the second one, but the second one is still a valid oath. Now, what does that mean? So remember, again, if there is no liability, does that not indicate that indeed it is not a valid oath? L'chidirava. The Amar Rava says, Nishal ala rishona al saloshniya tachteha. Because when Rava says that if for some reason you got the second, the first shvuah was revoked or was annulled, then ultimately again the second neder is not able to set in. So to say that this supports Rava, Misha nadar shtei neziros umanas harishon leverfish kav v'nishal. So listen to this. We had this yesterday. Someone took two nidrei neziros, two Nazirite vows, which normally would require you to what, based on what we just learned? Observe how many days of Naziros? 60 days, right? 2 periods of 30. And what happens? I counted the first 30. I even separated my carbon. And then I had the original neder annulled. So what is the halacha? The first 30 days that I observed can now go ahead and what? And count for the second neder. Kigon shekibel alav. So therefore again, but the Gemara, so we'll say the Gemara brings that down to show this idea of like a second neder kind of filling in the void when the first one is removed. Even though we're not talking about neder, we're talking about Shavuah. To which the Gemara says, well, that case is not a good case anyway. Why? The truth is, you already established you can't bring a raya from that particular case. Why not? Because that could be a case of simultaneous acceptance, simultaneous vows, where a person says, I am hereby accept upon myself two nidrei naziros, where everyone will agree in that case that both are valid, and therefore in the event that for some reason you didn't fulfill one or one was revoked, two could fill the voice. So we'll say what comes out. What comes out from this sugya is a very important idea. First of all, we paskin neder chal al neder. That's how we paskin. One neder could develop on another neder, and that's even true of what? Even if you made identical statements, even if you say Hareini Nazir Hayom, two identical statements, that creates an obligation for 2 consecutive periods of Nazirus. That's halacha number 1. Halacha number 2, we paskin ein shvua chal al shvua. Right? One oath cannot go ahead and devolve upon the individual if you've already made a first identical oath. However, the way we paskin is, that second oath doesn't totally go away in totality. Instead, what does it do? It kind of hovers over the individual. That in the event that for some reason a person was somehow released from that first oath, what would happen? Then second oath would have the opportunity to attach itself to the individual. Fine, says the Mishnah. But it's a new sugya. It's not a totally new sugya, but a new sugya. Says the Mishnah. Stam Nedarim lahachmir. So now we're going to get into something very interesting. So what does this mean? Stam Nedarim lahachmir. Take a look at the Ran. So it says Ran Stam Nedarim lahachmir uperusham lahakel. But their explanation is lakula. What does this mean? Says Ran Kilomar Mishen Adar v'yesh lefarishon lahachmir ulahakel kadei shelo piresh echad mehen lemanis kavein holchin bistam lachmir. I will say we're going to see that there are certain times that a person makes a neder, but their lashon is ambiguous. Lashon is ambiguous. Now the Mishnah is dealing with an interesting situation. What happens if someone makes a vow, an ambiguous vow? How do we interpret ambiguous vows? So we'll say, remember, let's say, now we'll see what you will say to yourself. Why don't you just ask the person what they meant? Well, sometimes a person is not sure exactly what it is that they meant, or other times the person is not there. We'll see the cases. In any event, what the Mishnah says as a principle is that if someone made an ambiguous vow, so we interpret it lahachmir. We accept the most stringent interpretation of their words. And we'll give examples of this. However, uperushan lahakel. Their explanation, however, allows it to be lenient. Look at the Ran again. Upeirushan lahakel impiresh achakach va'amar lekach niskavanti somchin al devarav afal pishu meko. So we'll say the Ran says like this: that let's say I make a neder and my neder is ambiguous. So the first statement of the Mishnah is if we don't know what you meant, we will attribute the stricter interpretation to your words. However, if I come back and I say, no, that's not what I meant. I meant, whatever the more lenient interpretation is, then what? I am believed. I am believed. It should both say that by itself is not a big chiddush. Of course, I made the neder, so of course I am believed to what? I am believed to qualify that neder as well. So the Gemara goes on. The Gemara says, the Mishnah says, I'm sorry. Ketzad. So let's give an example of this. Amar hare alai kebasar maliach kiyayin nesach. So what happens? Let's say I say that this loaf of bread, I'm just using loaf of bread as an example, should be unto me like salted meat and like libation wine. So I remember, now here's the interesting part. So what does this mean? What does this mean? Take a look at the Ran again. Ketzad hare alai kebasar maliach v'yayin nesach. Writes the Ran, Kilomar, Ketzad Karei Stam Nedarim. What's an example of a Stam Nedar, an ambiguous Nedar? Ha'omer Kebasar Maliach V'yayin Nesach. Demashma Shal Shamayim, V'karei Basar Maliach, Mishum Dechsiv, Akol Karbanacha, Takriv Melach, Umashma Nami Shal Avodos Kochavim Ki Agavna, Havi Stam Dar. So let's listen to this. So I say, I want this loaf of bread to be like salted meat. So salted meat can mean one of two things. Salted meat can mean sacrificial meat, or salted meat can mean avodah zarah, idolatry meat, right? Or the truth is, right, it could also mean regular meat. Although the problem is the reason why that doesn't make sense is because remember we'll say, what do we talk? I mean, that doesn't make sense. From Mr. Schoenfeld, it was an excellent question. Yeah. Excellent. So let me take a moment to compose myself. It was so good. So the idea over here is like this. Remember, what are we talking about over here? We're talking about hatfasa. So hatfasa, remember, is where you take a permitted item and you want to literally attach it, at least status-wise, to a prohibited item. So if a person says, this piece of meat should be, this loaf of bread should be like salted meat, the one thing we know he's not talking about your lunch meat. He's not talking about your steak. Right? How do we know that? Because your steak is permitted. So obviously he's trying to compare his loaf of bread to something that is prohibited. The issue over here is there are two things he could possibly be referring to. He could be referring to sacrificial meat, or he could be referring to avodah zarah meat. Now, what's the chiluk between those things? So remember again, let's go back, we're experts in this already. In order for hatfasa to work, in order to link a permitted item to a prohibited item, and for the permitted item to become prohibited, what has to happen? The prohibited item itself has to be a davar hanadar, something that is prohibited through a neder. But if it's a davar ha'asar me'atzmo, if ultimately again it is inherently asar, then what? Then hatfasa does not work. So listen to this. So therefore again, if you have this situation where I'm comparing my loaf of bread to a salted piece of meat, and what happens? I say it should be like basar maliyach. So what does he mean? If he means I'm comparing it to a carbon, then hatfasa will work. Because remember, every single animal becomes a carbon. How? Really through the process of being designated by the individual, which is like a neder. On the other hand, if I'm comparing the salted meat to what? To avodah zarah is inherently asr, and therefore again cannot work for hatfasa. Same thing with yayin nesach, libation wine. What am I referring to? Am I referring to sacrificial libation wine? In which case that is considered to be an item that became prohibited through a neder, in which case hatfasa would work. Or is it avodah zarah? And if it's avodah zarah, idolatry, that is inherently asr, and therefore what? And therefore hatfasa will not work. So I've also what the Gemara is telling me, therefore is what? So the Gemara, for example, kahari like yayin nesach, meaning the Mishnah, im bishal shlamim nadar asr. So if you have in mind that you want it to be sacrificial meat, then what? Then the hatfasa will work and the loaf of bread will become asr. Im bishal avodas kochavim nadar. But if on the other hand, again, you are comparing the loaf of bread to avodah zarah, then mutter, then ultimately again, it won't work. Rabbi said hatfasa won't work. It won't work again because avodah zarah is inherently asr. Therefore again, the imstam asr. So it says, here's the example. So if I made this neder, I say that this loaf of bread should be like basra maliyach, should be like salted meat, and I didn't qualify what that means. We interpret that statement stringently. What does stringently mean in this particular case? That we assume that what? That Basar Malech is referring to sacrificial meat, carbonic meat, because that's ultimately what makes the neder chal. So again, here's the example. I make a statement that is ambiguous, a little bit open-ended, can either refer to sacrificial meat, which again will work and therefore make the loaf of bread prohibited, or it could refer to avodah zarah meat, which will not work, and allow the bread to still remain permitted. We interpret my ambiguous words in a stringent fashion. Another example, Harei alai kecherem. I say this loaf of bread should be to me like cherem. Rabbi said, remember again, cherem means that it should be consecrated. Now understand that statement could also be interpreted in two distinct ways. Im kecherem shal shamayim. So I'll say a person could go ahead and if you make something cherem to Hashem means I give it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's dedicated to the Beis Hamikdash. So if you do that, then Abba said that, remember, the way you make something cherem is essentially through the process of a neder, right? I promise to give something. So if I'm comparing my loaf of bread to what we call cherem shel shamayim, to something that I consecrated to God, then what? Then such a hatfasa works, because I'm comparing the loaf of bread to something else that became prohibited through a neder. However, ve'im kecherem shel kohanim. Abba said there's another form of cherem, and what is that? That's called cherem shel kohanim. Cherem shel kohanim essentially is item that becomes the property of kohanim. The Rebbe said that item does not possess any inherent sanctity. It just becomes the property of the kohanim. Therefore, again, comparing something to cherem shel kohanim will not work for hatfasa, because the item itself of cherem shel kohanim is not considered the same that it's prohibited by a vow. Therefore, by comparing something permitted to that item, hatfasa does not take effect. Look at Rashi for just a moment here. Rashi says, "Im kecherem shel shamayim kigon nader shehitfis b'ma shehiktish legavo lekache bedekabayis." I'm comparing the loaf of bread. I'm connecting the loaf of bread to an item that I ultimately consecrated or sanctified to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the Beis Hamikdash, or kecher. So that will work because that item that is a proper hatfasa. On the other hand, kecherem shel kohanim shehitfis kecherem shel charmikanim dichsiv kol cherem v'yisrael l'chayiyah. The high habi mamon kohanim vavi murter kechulim. So we'll say, remember, cherem kohanim possesses no real sanctity. It just happens to be the property of the kohanim themselves. So again, vim stam. Therefore, I will say, if I just said that this loaf of bread should be cherem, but I did not what? I did not say what type of cherem I'm referring to. We interpret my words stringently, and again, stringently in this particular context means what? Stringently means that it refers to cherem shel shamayim. It refers to something consecrated to the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, again, that's considered to be an item that is prohibited by a vow, and therefore the ma'aser hatfasa will work. Fine. Next, harei alai k'ma'aser. Let's say a person says this loaf of bread should be prohibited to me like ma'aser. Now, remember again, there are two different types of ma'aser. There's ma'aser behema, and there's ma'aser dagam. So we'll say the Gemara wants to make the following suggestion. Person doesn't qualify what they're talking about. Im ki ma'aser behema. So if a person is comparing the loaf of bread to ma'aser, and remember ma'aser behema is you have to take the 10th animal and give it to the kohen. So if we're talking about ma'aser behema, then the neder works. Why? Look at the Ran for just a moment. So the Ran says ki ma'aser behema. Im ki ma'aser behema neder aser. The davar hanidor hu kishahaya kori la asiri asiri va'asur l'chol ad shekibem matir. So let's listen to this. So the Ran says that when you go ahead and the 10th animal comes out of the pen, you have to actively designate that animal as ma'aser behema. Because you have to actively designate it, therefore what? It has the status as a davar hanador, as a vowed item. Therefore, if you compare a permitted item to the ma'aser behema, hatfasa works. On the other hand, if you go ahead and you compare it to, however, avim shal goren, but if you compare it to meiser, of your crops, right, literally of your greenery, then mutter. Now, I'll say now, interestingly enough, let's assume right now that the reason for this is that meiser, right, meiser that you give of your crops, of your grain, is inherently usher. We'll go with that approach right now, although we'll challenge that later on. But let's assume right now that the meiser of your crops, even though you have to designate it, once it is designated, it becomes inherently usher. Therefore, it's called a davar ha-usher and not a davar ha-nadur. And therefore, again, hatfasa will not work. And therefore, v'im stam, if you made this statement, if you made an ambiguous statement, asr, we will assume that meiser refers to meiser behema, and therefore again that is a davar hanadar, a vowed item, and therefore tfasa will work. Next, harei like truma. I say that this bread should be to me like truma. So I'll say, what's the effectiveness of this statement? Well, it depends. Im kitrumas halishka nadar asr. So I'll say, remember, truma could refer to what? The chatzi shekel. So if I say that this loaf of bread should be to me like the half shekel, just like the half shekel is prohibited, so too the loaf of bread should be prohibited. Oh, the half shekel Rabbi say is a davar hanadar, right? People pledge their half shekels to the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, it has the status of an item that is also because of neder. If it's a davar hanadar, then what? Then hatfasa will work. Then if I compare a permitted item to this prohibited item, ultimately hatfasa will work, and the permitted item will become aser. So the Gemara says, "Ve'im shal gorin." However, again, if I'm referring to truma of my granary, the portion of my grain I give to the kohen, then Rabbi said that is considered to be a davar ha'aser. That is not a davar hanadar. That is not an item that is prohibited by a vow, but instead, ultimately, again, is an item that is prohibited in and of itself. Therefore, the neder will not be effective, and therefore, ve'im stam. But if I made this statement in an unqualified fashion, I did not explain what I meant, aser, then we will assume that truma means the half shekel, and therefore you are comparing your loaf of bread to an item that is prohibited by a neder, and therefore l'maisa, again, the neder works.
Doesn't truma have to be designated also?
I'm sorry? So that's the chiddush again of truma and meiser, that even though they're both actively designated, but once they are designated, that status of truma and meiser is an inherently usher status. So all the designation does, it shows, meaning I have to give truma and meiser, which means that there's a part of my crop that is already inherently usher. The designation says the isser is on this piece and not on this piece. But in the eyes of the Gemara, that's not called a davar hanadar. Davar hanadar is something that the status itself comes from the neder. Truma and meiser, the status doesn't come from the designation. The status is there. The designation just identifies which piece will be neder or which piece will be truma and meiser. It's an interesting chilik. So the Gemara is different. Meir. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Huda says, "Stop." Rabbi say now again. So here's what we have from the first part of the Mishnah. Everybody will agree with the basic statement of the Mishnah, which is that stam nedarim, if you make an unqualified neder, so unqualified neder ultimately has to be done. I mean, when we say unambiguous neder, it has two possible interpretations. One is lenient, one is stringent. We go with the stringent interpretation. But if a person goes ahead and later on qualifies that neder, he is believed to qualify that neder. Now the Mishnah ends off with something else. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Huda says, stam truma biYehuda asura begadol mutter. This is interesting. Rabbi Huda says that in the tribal area of Yehuda, if somebody says truma, we make the assumption that what are they referring to? That they're referring to the half shekel. They're referring to the half shekel, because since Ran points out, since they are in close proximity to the Beis Hamikdash, we assume that truma in Yehuda, if somebody says that this loaf should be to me like truma, we assume that in Yehuda, proximity to the Beis Hamikdash, truma means half shekel. Okay. On the other hand, begalil mutter. On the other hand, if somebody says that this loaf should be to me like truma, and they say it in the Galil, in the north of Eretz Yisrael, that we assume that they are referring to what type of truma? Grain truma. Right, grain truma, and therefore grain truma is inherently aser. Therefore, the neder does not work. Why? She'ein anshe galil makirin es truma salishka. Because the Rebbe says, since the people of the Galil are all the way in the north, therefore what? They don't have such connection to the Beis Hamikdash, and because of that, again, they don't identify more readily with the half shekel. So what Rabbi Yehuda is now telling us is that no, there are times where even if someone makes an ambiguous statement, sometimes we could understand based on their geography what they really meant. So if you say truma in Yehuda, because of proximity to the Beis Hamikdash, you're referring to the half shekel. If you say truma in the Galil, ultimately you're not referring to half shekel, you're referring to truma, to actual grain truma, and therefore your neder is not binding. He goes on. Stam charamim. Similarly again, if a person says this loaf should be chirim to me, so be Yehuda mutarin. In Yehuda, it's mutter. Why is it mutter in Yehuda? Because we assume that what type of chirim is the person referring to? Chermei kohanim. Right? Property of the kohanim. Also remember why in Yehuda is this so? Because in Yehuda, there are a lot of kohanim. Why are there a lot of kohanim in Yehuda? Apparently kohanim settled in Yehuda very often, because that is close to the Beis Hamikdash. So if you're a kohen, it makes sense to live in close proximity to the Beis Hamikdash, because remember, even though you didn't work, you only worked really 1 or 2 weeks a year in the Beis Hamikdash, but nevertheless you were there for regalim, so it makes sense to be close. So if you're in Yehuda, if somebody said this loaf should be like cherem, B'pashtus, they're referring to the cherem of the Kohanim. Now remember, Agun Rabosai, if you compare your loaf to the cherem of Kohanim, is that an effective neder? We establish no. Why? Because cherem Kohanim is not even inherently asur. On the other hand, begalil asurin. But if you say that my loaf should be like cherem and you're in the galil, that is an effective neder because we assume that cherem in the galil means what? Cherem means that you're actually consecrating something to the Beis Hamikdash. She'ein anshe galil ma'akir nes cherem kohanim, because the people in the galil are not really familiar with the cherem of the kohanim, because apparently there weren't a lot of kohanim that lived in the galil. Fine, says the Gemara the following: V'hatnan, but we learned. Now, what did we learn? V'hatnan, we learned Safek Nezirus Lahakel. So we'll say, so we learned that what? That any doubtful case of Nazirus, we are making. Now we'll say, remember again, so what the Gemara is asking is like this. What the Gemara is saying is, you just espoused the principle. What was the principle? That if you have a suffix, if you have an ambiguous lashon about a particular neder, you don't know what it means, and has two possible interpretations, one a lenient interpretation and one a stringent interpretation. What's the halacha say? We go with the stringent interpretation. So because we learned earlier that if you have a suffix Nazirus, a doubt about Nazirus, then we resolve that how? We resolve it leniently. And I will say, now what case are we referring to over here? It's actually very interesting. So Rashi points out the case over here is where a person says, Hareini Nazir, Imzeo Ploni Shaban Negdi Nazir. If I say like this, I will be a Nazir. You see that guy over there? If that guy passing in front of me is a Nazir, I'll be a Nazir also. Well, so now what happens? That guy will come, Reuven comes and goes. There's only one problem, which is what? I don't know if he was a Nazir or not. So what do I do in such a situation like that? So I will say the halacha is that ultimately we paskin that I am not a Nazir. Since again it's a doubt, I don't know if I'm a Nazir or not, a suffix Nazirus is resolved leniently. So how does that statement shtim with our Mishnah? Because the Mishnah says that what? Essentially, if you have a suffix in Nazirus, you have an ambiguous lashon, you resolve it stringently. But yet we see elsewhere that the halacha is, we have a Mishnah that says suffix Nazirus, we resolve it leniently. So which one is it? Rabbi Zir Lokash is a contradiction. Ha Rabbi Eliezer, ha Rabbanon. This Mishnah Rabbi said that the Gemara is bringing down, that reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer, whereas our Mishnah reflects the view of the Rabbanon. This Sanya, because what did we learn? Hamaktish chayaso behemto. Suppose it's an interesting case. If somebody consecrates either his chayas or his behemoth. So we'll say chayas means undomesticated animals, and behemoth means domesticated animals. Let's say a person, and now this is an either or case. A person is either consecrating all of his chayos or all of his behemoths. So we'll say, interestingly enough, there's an animal called a koi. So a koi seems to be some type of crossbreeding, mixed breed, and there's a shaila, is a koi considered to be an animal, a behemoth, or is it a behemoth, or is it a chaya? Now I'll say, this is not an academic designation, because interestingly enough, the halacha is, this has ramifications, for example, by kisei hadam, by covering the blood. Behemoths do not require kisei hadam, chayas do require kisei hadam, covering the blood after shechting, and other related halachas. So let's say, I say, all of my animals are hekdish. So does that include koi or not? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer lo hikdish es hakoi. So I will say, so again, the Rabbanon say yes. The Rabbanon say hikdish es hakoi. Your koi is included in your designation. Rabbi Eliezer says it is not. So the Gemara says, why not? So the Gemara says, Hi man do amar mamono ma'ayil esfeka. So we'll say, so the one who says that you are machmir with your possessions, and in cases of doubt we rule in a machmir situation, all the more so with your body as well. Therefore, I will say, the one who holds that koi is included in a safek case, like the Rabbanon be machmir when it comes to monetary issues, will certainly be machmir when it comes to issues regarding your person. Therefore, will be machmir in situations regarding ambiguous nedarim, and will say that you're chayiv. However, uman damra mamona lo ma'ayil, but the one who says that ultimately, again, we are not machmir with your money. So, for example, again, we do not include koi in your consecration. We'll say what? Gufei nami kol shekein de lo ma'ayil esveka. All the more so what? When it comes to matters of your body, i.e. nedarim, we will not be machmir as well. All right, we'll say we'll stop over here. We'll pick up with this machlokes tomorrow.